Hello and welcome to my madness. As I have said, my madness is the audacity that I would dabble in the realm of ideologies or political ideologies. But you know something? With what is happening today, it is important that we try to understand the mindset of all involved. I'm not talking necessarily about people involved, but people belong to political parties, and political parties are representations. And we we associate ourselves on purpose with those who think similar. So it is important that we gain an understanding of those political parties so that we can understand what's happening. And from that understanding, we can determine an appropriate response. Now, in the previous presentations, I talked about liberalism. I talked about the liberal left, which is essentially liberal Democrats. And here I'm going to present the conservative roles in the political parties. So conservative ideas are in both parties, just as both parties can trace their beginnings to liberalism. It is merely their interpretation of liberalism that has moved them apart. But when you get right down to it, it's like religion. All religions teach essentially the same thing: to nurture, to love. And both parties come down to the same thing: liberal ideas. Some of those ideas have morphed into something where social programs are needed to rescue humankind, and others, and another version of it, then humankind, each person is responsible for themselves. So what we're going to look at are the conventional roles in the political parties. Conservatism in the United States has been a significant force in shaping our nation's political landscape. Historically, the Republican Party has been associated with conservatism, and conservatism emphasizes limited government, individual liberty. See what I mean about this? Everybody has roots in liberal ideas. That is a liberal idea. Free markets, that is a liberal idea. Traditional values and national security. And the idea with traditional values is, they don't like a whole lot of change. This ideology has also found a place within the Democratic Party, but in a different form, because the Democrats are more open to social improvements. So we're going to look at the roles of conservatism and how they affect both parties. We'll look at some of the highlights and some of the contrasts. And to begin with, the roots of conservatism can be found in the early American Republic, as the two parties began to form. And as I said earlier, the Republicans were influenced by classical liberalism. They were influenced by the likes of John Locke and John Stuart Mill. And as I said, John Locke is often referred to as the father of liberalism, whose Two treatises of government has influenced the development of the democratic principles across the world. Voltaire has promoted the idea, or I should say, Voltaire has added the idea to liberalism, the idea of freedom of speech, religious tolerance, the separation of church and state, which in our case it's questionable there. We will, maybe I'll explore that later on, because the last time I looked into this for the religious organization I was with, I discovered that there is no real separation of church, and that what is implied is that the U.S. government cannot enforce or serve preference to a particular religion. And in our case, in the case of the United States, we have to keep in mind that when this was written, the majority of the people, the majority of those founding fathers were in some form of Christian denomination, or I should say associated with some form of Christianity, whether it was Protestantism or Lutheranism. I don't know if the Methodists were around there, Catholicism, or even, Freemasons and Rosicrucians. Believe it or not, those are, again, affiliated with Christianity. And we also have to look at Jean Rousseau, who's The Social Contract presented the idea that the government should reflect the will of the people. That's where we get this idea of government for the people, by the people. It's enforced there. And these authors, as well as other writers, like I said, there was John Stuart Mill. There's also Thomas Paine with his writing, Common Sense. They helped our founding fathers of the United States develop the guiding principles of our government. And the key tenets included a preference for a smaller government, or I should say for a small government, which is ideal. At that time, they didn't need a large, sprawling government. We may need it now in the world that we live in, because we have so much going on, and technology and communications have connected us in ways that they may never have foreseen. So we still should not have a sprawling government, but we should have a government to manage our presence on the global scene. That just makes sense. They also promote the idea that the government does not intervene in the lives of its citizens, and if it should intervene in the lives of its citizens, then it should rule on behalf of the individual. However, again, that has transmuted into something altogether different. Another tenet was individual responsibility. The whole idea of people acting responsible is, quite frankly, it's bizarre, because people do not act responsibly. They're too busy trying to isolate themselves, trying to be different, and as part of their role of trying to be different, they get in your face. So, and again, this commitment to preserving traditional values and institutions. And think of it like this. The cliche, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That is what they are referring to here with the idea of traditional values and institutions. So, since the Republican Party is more aligned with conservative ideas and such, let's look at conservatism within the Republican Party, which has traditionally been the home of conservatism in the United States. And since the mid 20th century, figures like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and Newt Gingrich and Donald Trump. Well, Mr. Trump is the president at this time, and all of them have championed the conservative cause within their party. And what they have actually done is they have these people, Goldwater, Reagan, Gingrich, and Trump, have reinterpreted conservatism. And let's look at Mr. Goldwater here, who in a failed bid for the presidency actually laid the groundwork for an ideological shift within the Republican Party. Because at one time, I don't know if you can remember this, maybe the younger viewers may not, but I do, because, well, I'm 60, so I remember when the Republican Party was more towards the center, meaning their position was more moderate. They still favored a smaller government, but their position was more of a moderate one. But with Mr. Goldwater here, he laid the groundwork to move them away from this centrist position here. And Ronald Reagan, or President Reagan, when he took office, he furthered that idea. He started what has been referred to as the Reagan Revolution, and he built upon the idea of a smaller government and lower taxes. And we'll probably get to these ideas about lower taxes in a moment, but let's do a brief review of these people who shaped what we are familiar with today. And Newt Gingrich, when he was in Congress, he introduced the idea of the contract with America. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, because that has come up a few times, not very much, but a few times in the news rhetoric. And this idea of the contract with America was to unite the party, encourage tax cuts and welfare reform, and a most bizarre idea, balance the budget, which I might add was accomplished under President Clinton. And Mr. Trump's contribution, and this will focus mostly on his first term, not what's going on right now, because this is, well, I don't even want to go into that. So Mr. Trump's contribution was his appeal to the working class. His appeal to the working class is what formulated and expanded the Republican Party base. Because beforehand, the Republican Party was always referred to as those people who owned businesses. Well, Mr. Trump changed that, and if the Democrats had been paying attention, they would have noticed this, but he changed that approach by appealing to the working class voters in rural United States. That was key. That was very important. He appealed to small business, you could say, whereas before that, the Republicans appealed to the corporations. Well, he managed to bring in the small businesses farmers. That is a small business. And with that, he was able to broaden the party's position on the economy and to present social conservatism and traditional family roles, increased role of religion, and religious morals in decision making. Now, that's something that we are still grappling with, is religious morals, because we don't know what type of morals connected to religion that he is promoting. Well, obviously, it's not any of the progressive interpretations of religion, but more of a traditional interpretation of religion. And also, now this is apparent, along with religious morals, he has brought into the mix conventional marriage, conventional sexuality, conventional genders. Now, keep in mind here that marriage is essentially a contract. It has nothing to do with love. Marriage merely gives someone the authority to varying amounts of personal property. Each one, not one or the other, but typically each one. When you go through a divorce, well, then all assets have to be divided, and not always equitable. So, and, conventional interpretations, this is it here, conventional interpretations of sexuality and gender. Because within the realm of science, now I know many people view science as just another form of fiction, but within the realm of science, okay, the body can be programmed as one gender and exhibit signs of another gender. That has been demonstrated through variety of research projects. And all of this takes place in the fetus, as the fetus is developing. I'm not going to go into the particulars of that, but there is scientific position to support this whole concept of transsexuals, gays, and lesbians. Scientific support is there. However, as I said here, conventional sexuality, conventional genders, only two. Conventional. Now let's consider the political philosophy of conservatism. And we begin with limited government, promoting reduced government spending. Wow, what a concept. A reduction in government spending, lowering taxes, deregulation to promote economic growth and personal freedoms. Well, let's consider some of this. President Reagan added 186% increase. Now remember, the political philosophy of conservatism is to reduce government spending, not increase it. And President Reagan added 186% to the national debt. And this was done through, much of it was done through tax cuts. If you cut taxes here, then you have to cut spending someplace else to compensate. You just can't cut and spend. It doesn't work that way. And it's always been like that. We see that now. In fact, President Trump in his first presidency added 7.8 trillion to the national debt through tax cuts, increased defense spending, the same as Ronald Reagan, President Reagan. They both increased the national debt through tax cuts and defense spending, which, tax cuts is a good platform. It's a good selling platform. But if you're going to give people more money to spend, then the government had better rein in their spending as well. Another point in the philosophy of conservatism is free markets, supporting capitalism and opposing government intervention in the economy, which is good. However, we have to keep in mind this whole idea of regulations. Right now, they are looking at deregulations. The Republican Party has always looked at deregulations. And what we have to keep in mind is why these regulations were put in place in the first place. The financial sector was regulated because they took advantage of citizens through mortgages, through financial fees, particularly with credit cards, through subprime loans. And this is just what comes to mind. I'd have to do more research to get more examples. It's not that we should throw all the regulations out, but these regulations should be reviewed like anything else. You buy a vehicle, you have maintenance on that vehicle. And when you don't do the maintenance on the vehicle falls apart. That's what we are seeing. Social programs, regulations, and such, none of it has been reviewed. None of it has been reevaluated to determine whether it needs to be tweaked, if something was too stringent, or, nothing to see if adjustments needed to be made. Nothing. So, and deregulating everything is, again, not a solution, because there are protections there that are needed. And then we have the traditional family values, religious liberty, and something called moral absolutism. We'll get to that one in a moment. So, family values, these include pro-life policies, parental rights and education, public expression of religion, moral standards and religious principles according to their interpretation. What I mean by their interpretation, I mean according to the conservatives, or whichever conservative happens to be in power, according to their interpretation. And moral standards are going to be tied to religious standards. I'd like to say it doesn't work that way, but if you are supporting the religious principles, then the moral religious principles are going to be tucked in there right along with it. It's just a package deal. And parental responsibility. Here's a good one. Parental responsibility. I am wholeheartedly in agreement with that, because a majority of the parenting that I see is irresponsible. Parents are supposed to provide emotional support for their children. The only time emotional support is provided is when it's advantageous to them. That's how our country, our society has developed. If it's good for me, then I will help you. But I have to get something out of it. Everything is a bargain, including what we do with our children. Emotional support, financial support. Well, there's another one with that. If there was financial support and emotional support, our students would not be shipped off to these schools to be cared for. School is not a daycare center. Parents have responsibility, educational support. There is no educational support. When you hit 18, out the door you go. You stay in school. I don't care if you pass or not. You stay in school till you're 18, then you're out the door, then you're no longer my problem. That is insane. It's just insane. Parents should be involved with their children's education, not just as an excuse or whatever else. What's going on today? Oh, well, there are these progressive ideas that are being presented, and I don't want my child exposed to that. Never mind the people that child may hang out with. If parents took a more involved role in their children, they may not end up as addicts. They may not end up as living on the streets. They may not end up as being poor. There's just so much there. I'm not going to go into it anymore. I'm probably getting on your nerves with it. And then we have the traditional gender roles. And I talked about this a moment ago. These are one parent, typically the mother, serves as the primary caregiver, and the other parent, traditionally the father, providing financial support. That is traditional gender roles. Listen up, ladies. This is their intention for you. Because traditionally, the man of the house cannot be at home taking care of the kids, not if they are going with traditional gender roles. Think about it. And then religious liberty, being the ability to practice your religious belief without government interference and to protect them from being compelled to act against their religious beliefs, particularly when it involves marriage, gender, and abortion. In other words, they are all for discrimination, because that's what religious liberty does. It discriminates against everybody else. It is essentially saying, if you're not part of my group, you are something else. That is exactly what was practiced in the Old Testament. In some cases, that's continually being practiced today. Thus, here are the problems that we are experiencing on a social scale. And of course, there is national security, which prioritizes a strong defense and a strong military. Conservative ideology. Now let's talk about moral absolutism, which was mentioned earlier there. And a central part of the Republican conservatism is moral absolutism, meaning the belief that certain moral principles are universal and unchanging and applicable to all individuals regardless of context and circumstance. I wonder what that could be, because in my experience and in my readings and research and everything, there is no such thing as a universal principle, a universal truth, or anything else that is unchanging, because the principle of nature is change. Change is going to happen. If there was no such thing as change, then we wouldn't have internet. We wouldn't have computers. We wouldn't have automobiles. We would never have even began to write. And this perspective is in contrast to moral relativism, which suggests that moral values are based upon your personal interpretation, my interpretation, and that these morals vary based on culture, based on the movement, because today's culture is not the same as the culture during the mid 1800s or the mid 1700s. All of that changes. Situations continually change. However, they say that there are clear distinctions between right and wrong, which is a myth, because if there were clear distinctions between right and wrong, we would not be seeing all this stuff playing out in the courts, would we? So there is no clear distinction between what is right and wrong. There is only a clear distinction between what one person wants to do and what another person does not want to do. And moral absolutism is what supports the party's position on abortion, marriage, and religious freedom. They believe that there are clear distinctions here, black and white. That's the mindset, black and white. The pro-life position is grounded in the belief that life begins at conception. And that traditional marriage is a union exclusively between one man and one woman. Well, they are also of the opinion that this is morally superior. I got news for you. If marriage was based on love, you would not need a contract. But marriage is not based on love. Marriage is based on a legal agreement. Therefore, this whole idea of same-sex marriage is a moot point. If you base marriage on love, then you do not need a marriage certificate. And if you want to ensure that whomever gets the rights to whatever you have after you have expired from this life, that's what a will is for. It would be more advantageous to this country if we didn't base so much on the concept of marriage, special privileges for being married. That it should be equal all the way down the line. But marriage is not about equality. Marriage is about ownership. The Violence Against Women Act was about interstate domestic violence, defined as causing bodily injury to a spouse or intimate partner and involving some kind of travel across state lines. And through this act, they also created the private right of action, civil rights remedy, which allowed victims of violence fueled by gender animus or hostility to sue their assailants rather than relying on criminal courts. And this included the right to sue their husbands. And according to the Rights Clause, all persons within the United States have the right to be free from crimes of violence motivated by gender. An unwilling wife would acquire the right to sue her husband for rape, even in states that still adhered to the rule that rape was ravishing a woman without the consent assumed in marriage. So, there were states that if you were married, your husband had a right to rape you. And in 2000, the Rights Clause was no longer part of the Violence Against Women Act. The Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional in a rape case. The court reined in the commerce power and denied the 14th Amendment applied to private wrongs, revoking the right of women to seek justice. The court also indicated, well, you don't need to know the rest of that, but that gives you an idea. Now, I don't know if that's changed now. It may have, but that was the position, and that is the position being advocated for marriage. Religious freedom is another area where moral absolutism is evident, because the party champions policies that protect the right of individuals and organizations to act according to their religious beliefs. And that means that they can manipulate their religion, their doctrine, to absolve them of quite a bit. And the idea here with these conservative tenets and such is that the religious beliefs take preference over secular norms, because the religious principles represent absolute moral truths, meaning there's no room for argument. And in practice, Republican conservatism has led to policies such as tax cuts, deregulation, opposition to social programs, and a strong position against illegal immigration. Illegal immigration, well, that says it right there. The Democrats should support policies against illegal immigrants. Illegal is illegal. You break the law. What happens when you break the law? There are penalties. So that should be accepted with that. And when it comes to cutting taxes, this is really, to me, this is really mind-boggling. The idea of cutting taxes is to stimulate economic growth through increasing your disposable income. That makes sense. Okay. However, there's also the assumption that lower corporate taxes encourage companies to invest, to expand, which increases employment, which increases more money in your pocket. However, the problem is that with this approach, it does not include a reduction in spending. Therefore, the tax cuts that get pushed through increase the deficit, which means that now the deficit, and I'll go probably do a presentation on this sometime later, but the deficit is supported through bonds, treasury bonds that are sold to investors, often in different countries and such. And people buy these bonds with the expectation of a return. And what this indicates is that the country is supported through debt, meaning the country owes everybody else. What the country takes in is not matched by what they spend. They spend more than they take in. Now, if this were a company, the company would go bankrupt. It's that simple. The United States can go bankrupt. That's why they keep borrowing more and more and more and more. So let's look at conservatism in the Democratic Party, because this paints an altogether different picture. We've been focusing on the Republicans. Let's look at the Democrats. And typically they are associated with progressive and liberal ideas. Not everybody supports those ideas. And you've got a group within them called, well, blue dog Democrats or conservative Democrats. Conservative Democrats sound much better. And they advocate for fiscal conservatism and moderate social policies. Still a strong national defense, which is good. And just to give you a, for instance here, Senator Joe Manchin, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, consistently worked with Republicans to reach compromises that benefited both parties. Wow, what a concept. If that were to happen today, we could avoid so much, but we can't do that. And Senator Manchin typically took a moderate position on policies involving energy and fiscal responsibility. And his position helped in the Inflation Reducing Act, advocating for balanced environmental goals with economic concerns. Now that's government in action. Another one is Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who also worked with Republicans, bringing compromise to the infrastructure bill in 2021. She made economic moderation a centerpiece in her approach to legislature. Great. This is what we need. This is what we need. And their political philosophy was, again, fiscal responsibility, meaning that the budget should be balanced, the national debt should be reduced, which, by the way, is in line with the old conservative thought, reduction in spending, and promoting efficient government spending. Now, that's something that Mr. Trump is trying to champion while he is increasing the national debt. Now, this whole idea of reducing the national debt and balancing the budget and promoting government spending was accomplished under President Clinton, whose policies not only reduced the budget, but led to a booming economy and surpluses. And he too was interested in streamlining and making the government more efficient. How come a Democrat can succeed where a Republican cannot? Moderate social policies is another one that is promoted, suggesting that it's better for incremental social changes rather than radical changes, which is something the Democratic Party in general promotes, radical changes. No, we should go in steps. We should evaluate the policies that are being developed, that are being proposed, When they pass, they should be evaluated, tweaked, adjusted, all sorts of things to make sure that they are efficient. And the conservative Democrats as a whole, they support policies that promote welfare reform, stricter immigration controls, moderate taxes. They understand the need for taxes. And I'll present something along those lines later, but taxes are needed. Every time you cut taxes, there's some program that will be cut. Infrastructure is reduced. So both parties have a conservative vein in them. Republicans more so than the Democrats. Republican conservatives are more about minimal government intervention in the economy, while the Democratic conservatives would prefer fiscal responsibility. Republican conservatives, they are all about traditional values and often align themselves with religious values and what they call moral absolutism, meaning no wiggle room. It's all black and white. Whereas the conservative Democrats are more in the center there. They would rather adopt moderate policies on social issues and support gradual change while not losing sight of traditional principles. They're more flexible. And national security, both types of conservatives prioritize national security, but their approaches are different. Republicans are more about military strength, while the Democrats are more about diplomacy. All in all, conservatism influences both parties. It is in both parties, but they interpret it differently. One is all about conservative principles, whereas the other, their conservative party within the party is more about a more moderate position here. Right now, we have two extremes. We have the progressive extreme and the traditional extreme, and they do not mix. We need something that's more in between that can bring out the best of these progressive ideas, the best of these traditional ideas, bring them together, knit them together into something that benefits all involved. I do hope that this was helpful. As I said, it's really important to understand the mindsets of these two parties and where they are coming from. In a previous presentation, we talked about liberalism in the Democratic Party and also the liberal influences in the Republican Party. And in this instance, we talked about Republican conservatism and how it influences the Democratic Party. Liberal ideas and conservative ideas, they are the bedrock of this country. And it's when they are in extreme opposition that nobody wins. And I mean nobody. If the Democrats get in office, the first thing they're going to do is exactly what the Republicans did, which was exactly what they did previously. We can't have that. We need both. We need something that's closer to the middle. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I hope this madness was not too annoying. So you have a wonderful day and enjoy.